If you have ever traveled abroad, you will know that not all countries use the same currency. I mean, basically everyone knows that. I might make my YouTube money in US dollars, but of course, now that I live in Germany, I spend all that money in euros. And yet, despite the core purpose of the euro, I won't have to travel very far to use a different currency altogether. Be it Danish krona, Swedish krona, British pounds, Polish zloty, Czech koruna, Romanian leu, Turkish lira, or really whatever else I could find myself using after a 19-euro flight with EasyJet. Although collecting foreign currencies may be incredibly fun, after the umpteenth time visiting a particular country, converting to different currencies can get a little inconvenient. And also, perhaps a little annoying to remember that paying, for example, 10 ringgit for a shawarma in Malaysia, is not nearly as much of a ripoff as paying 10 euros for a shawarma in Berlin. This is exactly why the euro was put into place. So what would it be like if we had a singular currency, not just for half of a particular continent, but also for the whole world? Brought to you by generous support from viewers like you on Patreon. So first, why do we do this to ourselves? How did this whole thing get started? Well, it's much the same reason as to why countries have different languages, cultures, or even power outlets. Basically, there was no original global currency. What I mean by this is that the idea of a standardized currency was an idea that had come about independently in numerous different cultures over the millennia. If you happen to watch educational YouTube channels as much as I do, this is probably a story you've heard numerous times already, so I'll keep it somewhat brief. In the beginning of human civilization, people traded using a simple bartering system, literally just trading whatever good you made for whatever good you wanted. The problem with this, of course, is that if you sell bread and I sell cows, it's very inconvenient if I only wanted 2 loaves of bread, since 2 loaves are not worth a whole cow. Especially considering cows back then would have been much more useful alive, which in this case, the process of denomination generally does not allow for. And of course, it's possible you just don't want cows. In response to this fairly universal problem, just about every complex civilization developed some sort of common material for everyone to trade, be it metals, seashells, emeralds, or even sheets of paper. These were better than using life forms because of their whole non-perishability thing, but also allow traders to actually trade with precise amounts. So if I gave you this exact amount of gold for this exact amount of bread, you can now be certain that set amounts of gold will also buy you this exact amount of wool or whatever else you're into. This proved to be such a good idea that different cultures all around the world all had this idea completely independently of one another, and so developed different standardizations. Since there's no intrinsic value in gold or seashells, so you can kind of use whatever's around that's somewhat rare, which with a few slight tweaks pretty much brings us to today. Okay, well actually quite major tweaks, but still. This means that transactions are more or less the norm in international trade, which can be incredibly tough to deal with, so could we even establish a world currency to circumvent all this? Well, first, there's one thing that I haven't mentioned. Something both important to understanding why some countries might be reluctant to switch over to a global currency, the one thing that serves as virtually the foundation of the foreign exchange market, or forex, and yet another annoyance to travelers everywhere. The value of a currency fluctuates in comparison to that of other currencies. As in, just as an example, one day $1 US might be worth 422 Malaysian ringgit, and then a few days later 439, and then perhaps something really bad happens in Malaysia and the value of the ringgit completely plummets. This can actually be very useful to countries which control their own currencies in a time of financial instability, since they can either slow down inflation to deflate their currency so their citizens have more purchasing power, or speed it up to shrink the currency and make the country more attractive to foreign visitors. To perhaps help us answer this whole question, let's look at the smaller examples the real world has already provided us. There are quite a few multinational currencies out there. The most famous of these is of course the euro, but many countries in Central and West Africa use the CFA franc, and many Caribbean nations use the East Caribbean dollar. Also, many smaller nations share currencies with other bigger nations, such as, not including PEG's currencies, the US dollar, Australian dollar, South African rand, Indian rupee, and many others. So, how's all that going for them? Well, currency unions naturally have their fair share of advantages and disadvantages. Smaller countries, at least those that don't have the luck of literally being Singapore, can use a more competitive currency. Exchanges become easier, and they could help weather a financial disaster. However, they generally cannot dictate their own monetary policy, and just because one of the nations in the group is booming, doesn't necessarily mean all the others are too. Perhaps the best example we could take for both sides of the coin, pun slightly intended, is Zimbabwe. In 2007, the Zimbabwe dollar famously entered a period of hyperinflation, where the value of the Zimbabwe dollar plummeted to the point where prices doubled every 24 hours, resulting in the Zimbabwe dollar being redenominated 3 times just to remove all the extra zeros. By the end of all this, 1/4 Zimbabwe dollar was really 10 septillion or 10 to the 25 first Zimbabwe dollars. Shortly afterward, Zimbabwe started using foreign currencies like the euro, British pound, and especially the US dollar, which has worked to stave off hyperinflation, but has of course not allowed the country much independence in its finances. As Europe has had to deal with, creating a kind of one-size-fits-all currency, while certainly not impossible, is still incredibly difficult without careful financial decisions, which would probably explain why the Eurozone has strict economic requirements for a country to be able to join. The euro, of course, has also famously struggled in its adolescence. It's become a somewhat more stable currency recently, but its value was deeply threatened by the Greek economic crisis. In contrast, the US dollar is perhaps the safest currency in the world, and by far the most widely traded of any currency, pushing the euro to a distant second, even though the US also had various union-related troubles growing up. More about that in a possible future video. This is because the US can be classified as an optimum currency area, where an area is so politically and economically linked that it basically wouldn't make sense for the states to have different currencies, like in the colonial era where they were basically different countries. Thus, the only way to truly circumvent these economic problems would be to unite not just the currencies, but also everything else in the world. So basically, the best pros for a global currency, aside from all the benefits for tourists and business travelers, would be no more Zimbabwe-like scenarios, but the downsides would include possibly more Greece-like scenarios. Also, currencies cannot be traded for a profit on the market, so not stocks. There's one more pressing question that would need to be addressed though, especially regarding inflation and interest rates. Who would control this currency? A global currency would be a vast responsibility and a vast source of power for any one group to take, especially regarding finding a way for it to fit economies from that of the US, to that of Turkey, to that of Madagascar. Overall, I'm not saying this would be a bad idea, far from it in fact, but whoever's in charge of organizing this should understandably tread lightly. Thanks for watching, and thanks to my friend Barris from the French history channel This Is Barris for helping look over the script. Okay, now for my weekly barrage of different things I want you to do, even though you're probably not going to do any of them. Go subscribe to his channel, join the Discord server, support the channel on Patreon, like this video, and subscribe to KhAnubis to learn something new every Sunday.